Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. Today's episode was taped live in front of a virtual audience as part of a series of episodes examining the relationship between climate and security, produced in partnership with CGIAR, the world's largest global agricultural innovation network. The episode today, which is the 7th in our series, examines the relationship between climate security and inequality in Vietnam. The episode kicks off with Grazia Pacillo, senior economist at CGIAR Climate Security, explaining the results of a report about the impact of climate variability on inequality in Vietnam. I then moderate a discussion with a diverse array of panelists who dive deeper into the ways in which climate variability impacts economic and social inequality in Vietnam and what can be done about it. To listen to other episodes in this series, please visit globaldispatchespodcast.com or click on the link in the show notes of this episode. And now here is today's special episode.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 7th Climate Security webinar. My name is Grazia Pacillo, and I'm Senior Economist for the CGIAR Climate Security Focus. The Climate Security webinar series is part of the CGIAR Climate Security Focus, where we are aiming to link climate impacts to its drivers of security. In today and next week's event, titled Charting the Path to Peace, we will try and shed light on some of the latest policy and initiatives working to ensure that all people in Vietnam and Indonesia have equal opportunities and resilience to climate variability. This event is part of the Climate Variability in Indonesia and Vietnam Research Project, funded by the European Union French Agency for Development Research Facility on Inequality. Today, our focus will be on Vietnam. Climate change and variability in Vietnam has been remarkable in the past 20 years. The average surface temperatures have increased by 1 degree Celsius, with the southern provinces of the Central Highlands Central Coast warming even more. Between the end of 2015 and the early 2016, El Niño event caused extensive droughts, especially in the Central Highlands, where severe consequences on food security and livelihood have been documented. Mountainous areas in northern regions are increasingly experiencing devastating floods. And finally, with more than 70% of the Vietnamese population living in the coastal areas and low-lying deltas, Vietnam is highly exposed to riverine and coastal flooding, which not only threatens economic activities such as rice production, but also directly affect people's livelihoods. It is estimated that between 2007 and 2050, economic losses due to climate change will range between 6 and 15 billion US dollars. And these losses are likely to be concentrated in certain sectors, such as agriculture, and certain population groups, the poorest, vulnerable, and most marginalized. Recent evidence suggests that agriculture is not the only sector that is and will be affected by climate variability. The rapid development of the past decade in Vietnam has moved a lot of people out of farm activities to wage and non-farm employment in urban areas. Some of these people are most marginalized and disadvantaged, such as migrants, women, and ethnic minorities. Their living and working conditions are precarious and as exposed to climatic conditions as those of people working in agriculture. It is widely recognized that the existence of structural inequalities, such as the ones linked to ethnicities, remoteness, gender, and age, can worsen the ability of the poorest and most marginalized to respond to the climate challenge. We believe that this could be the case in Vietnam. For instance, marginalized groups such as ethnic minorities often live in remote and rural areas, with the infrastructure that is less resilient to climate impacts, have scarce voice and political representation, and often suffer from marginalization and conservative social norms, which altogether might hinder their capacity to access a diversified set of productive assets to improve their current economic status and finally reduce their vulnerability to climate hazards. Failures to protect the poorest and most marginalized from climate impacts in both rural and urban areas will create the conditions for poverty traps and further social exclusion, ultimately contributing to widen the gap between the richest and the poorest. Vietnam is among the fastest growing low and middle income countries in Southeast Asia. Its effort in reducing poverty rates have been outstanding in the past decades. And as of now, about 5% of the population lives under the poverty line. Despite these remarkable results, inequality has been steadily increasing, and the divide between richest and the poorest has widened even more in rural and remote areas, and those areas that are mostly populated by ethnic groups, minorities ethnic groups. Economic inequality is reinforced by inequality of voice and opportunities in this country, with the poorest often excluded in favor of the rich. To give some numbers, Oxfam estimates that Vietnam's 210 super rich earn more than enough in 1 year to lift 3.2 million people out of poverty and to end extreme poverty. Studies on the direct impact on climate change and variability on inequalities are limited, as the literature mostly focuses on the direct effect on poverty and treats inequality as a secondary and consequential issue. But we know that poverty and inequality are very distinct phenomena and often follow different patterns, as demonstrated in the case of Vietnam. Furthermore, a large majority of the previous studies analyzes the relationship between climate and inequality across countries, with less attention to how different groups within each country are impacted by climate hazards. In these analyses, we use a within-country approach to dig deeper in the relationship between climate and variability and inequality, and to understand whether this impact is bigger for the most vulnerable people in Vietnam, and whether this contributes to increased inequality in the country. In other words, in our analysis, we tried to understand whether climate variability is regressive, or better, we wanted to understand whether climate variability impacts are bigger for those who are less able to cope with these consequences. And if so, what can we do to ensure an equal, sustainable economic development for all in Vietnam? Our results show that the effect of climate variability is indeed regressive, as income decreases and income inequality increases with changes in climatic conditions. The most affected areas are those that have historically been more affected by El Niño-related events, such as Central Islands, Southeast and Mekong Delta regions. Ethnic minorities, rural, and farming households are bearing the biggest burden of these impacts and have a lower probability to escape poverty in the medium to the long term. Our analysis also suggests that some of the most vulnerable households, especially rural and ethnic minorities, might be using transfers and remittances as an insurance mechanism to cope with the short-term impact of climate variability. These coping capacities, however, seem to mostly focus on the short term, while long-term uncertainties remain. In conclusion, we believe that understanding the direct relationship between structural inequality and climate variability is of paramount importance for the policy development in Vietnam. Despite the existence of many policies designed to target and support low-income groups in coping with emergencies, these policies are often have little relevance to the needs, rights, and priorities of the most marginalized groups. The lack of participation and voice in places of power has, in recent years, worked in favor of the better off and widened the gap between these and the most vulnerable. Our study contributes to this discussion and suggests that more real-time evidence is needed on who bears the biggest impact of the climate events, and ask for an increased effort to monitor these impacts specifically in remote, rural, and agricultural areas, while often left behind. We also believe that for short-term solutions are not enough. Despite developing sustainable coping and adaptive strategies with and for the most vulnerable groups in both urban and rural areas will be essential. This is especially important for ethnic minorities, who are the ones who are bearing the biggest burden of the climate impacts. Providing voice and representation to these groups will be pivotal for an equal and sustainable development for all in Vietnam. Now, before introducing our speakers and starting the discussion, I would like to invite you all to watch a short video on the importance of understanding the linkages between climate impacts and peace and security across the globe. Thanks.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm editor of UN Dispatch and host of the Global Dispatches podcast. Today's conversation about climate variability and inequality in Vietnam is being recorded as a live taping of the podcast. Vietnam has been deeply impacted by climate change over the last 20 years. With more than 70% of its population living in coastal areas and low-lying deltas, Vietnam is highly vulnerable to riverine and coastal flooding. Meanwhile, El Niño events have caused droughts and water shortages in many provinces. Vietnam is also a country that has experienced rapid economic growth over the past several decades. Still, that growth has not been equitably experienced by all. Rural and agrarian communities and members of ethnic minority groups have not seen their livelihoods increase at the same pace. Today's conversation will explore the linkages between climate variability and inequality in Vietnam. Our conversation is informed by a report by the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities titled, "Who Bears the Burden of Climate Variability? Unpacking the Impact of Weather Conditions on Inequality in Vietnam." As in our conversation today, this paper explores the various ways that climate variability impacts poorer populations in Vietnam. And I'll post a link to the report on globaldispatchespodcast.com. Our conversation today is a dissemination event that is part of the research project called Climate Variability in Indonesia and Vietnam from the EU AFD Research Facility on Inequalities, developed with the financial support of the European Commission and the coordination of the French Development Agency, AFD. The research presented today is a complement to other climate research initiatives in Vietnam that AFD supports, such as the GEMS Project Vietnam, modeling the socioeconomic impacts of climate change in Vietnam, as well as adaptation strategies up to 2050. So with that, let me introduce our panelists today. Cécile Leroy is EU Program Manager, European Union Development Cooperation in Vietnam. Welcome. Hai On Dang is a senior economist with the World Bank. Welcome. Phuong Vu is senior officer at the International Cooperation Department, Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development in Vietnam. Welcome. Yanto Hess is Climate Change Adaptation Technical Specialist at the UN Development Program. Welcome. And finally, Nguyen Ngoc Huy is Senior Climate Change Advisor with Oxfam in Vietnam. Now let's start our conversation. Phuong Vu, the first question will go to you. The Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development is responsible for supporting the agriculture industry in Vietnam, and agriculture is by far the sector that suffers the most from climate change. Can you say a word on how the ministry, which is known as MARD, has dealt with the complexity and extent of climate impacts, and what have been some of its biggest interventions across the country? And also, can you say a word about how competition for natural resources, such as water or land, or the lack of protection by national institutions has contributed to tensions and grievances among rural populations in regions affected by water insecurity, such as the Mekong Delta? So, Phuong Vu, over to you to start our conversation. Thank you.
Good evening from Vietnam. MARD the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development has dealt with the complexity and the extent of the climate impacts. That MAT is the standing organization of the Central Committee for Flood and Storm Control. We, in cooperation with other line ministries and locality to implement the prevent and response and also recovery solution with the focus on the four sport. The four sport approach, we call it the focuses on the sport, command on the sport, vehicles on the sport, and the logistic on the sports. And for MAT, the biggest intervention are: one, raise community awareness on the climate impact. Second, to strengthen disaster risk governance. Third, invest in the reduction and resilience. And fourth, we enhance the disaster preparedness for the post recovery. And for the competition on the natural resources, such as water, land, or lack of protection from the national institution, contributed to the insertions of tension among the rural populations. As you know, that the climate change contribute to the tensions of the rural populations, such as the lack of underground water, the pollution, and also especially the saline intrusion in the Mekong Delta area, and the agricultural land loss, the reduction of the crop production, and also the degradation of the forestry and ecology. So for these activities, we have some solution like regional planning in the Mekong Delta regions. We have the agriculture cultivation changing into the climate adaptations. And for the, we also promote the regional coordination mechanism at the Mekong Delta region, focusing on the economic development policies. The best, and we think that the best way is to invest in the infrastructure, because here we have very limited infrastructure for the climate impacts and the natural disaster risk management. Another solution is that we support the local in social and economic development planning to attract investment and develop human resources and attract other tourism also. Thank you.
Thank you. That provides a very helpful conversation for very helpful context for the rest of our conversation. And Cecile Loa, I'm going to turn to you now. The EU has been a key player in climate security in Vietnam. More recently, the Asia Investment Facility has funded a wide range of projects, including those related to climate mitigation and adaptation. Can you tell us a bit more about what the facility is doing in that regard, particularly as it relates to supporting more vulnerable populations? Also, I would love to get your take on how serious is the inequality challenge in Vietnam, and how can interventions that tackle climate impacts contribute to the prospect for a sustainable and peaceful growth in Vietnam?
Well, thank you, Mark, and good evening from Vietnam, everyone. So regarding your first question about the Asia Investment Facility, it is funding from the European Commission to help the sustainable infrastructure development in Vietnam. So that works with combining grant from the European Union and own resource of the government of Vietnam, as well as the loan from the European financing institution. And together we partner to ensure the future infrastructure are more sustainable. So very often what is done with the grant from the EU is to provide technical assistance to address some issue of local governance, to ensure participatory planning of the local community, and to ensure that this infrastructure are in line with international standards regarding environment and social aspect of this. What we do is we can finance mitigation, investment for mitigation in energy, public transport, for example, or we can also work on adaptation aspects. But in the case for Vietnam, and if we continue on the Mekong Delta, one example is how you address coastal erosion, and it can be done with soft infrastructure like working on the mangrove forest rehabilitation. And here you are achieving both protection as well as encouraging sustainable livelihood for the community by providing better protection as well as livelihood for them. How serious? I think, like in any other country, the inequality are very serious, and climate change is worsening the divide between the vulnerable community and the most lucky part of the population. It worsened because indeed this population, the vulnerable community, are less resilient, they are less equipped, they have less access to finance, to education, to training, to works, to communication. So there is a lot that makes them even more vulnerable. And how we can intervene and contribute in a more sustainable way, I think one key element is really the local governance and the inclusiveness and the togetherness, and going with more participatory planning, especially when it comes for the use of natural resources.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will turn to Yanto Hess now from the UN Development Program. Yanto Hess, can you please help us understand better what UNDP is doing to enhance climate coping capacity of the most vulnerable groups in the population, such as ethnic minorities? And what is, in your view, the linkages between increasing climate impacts, lack of opportunities to escape poverty, and insecurity across the region, across Southeast Asia?
Yes, thank you very much, Mark, for your question. First of all, I would like to say that UNDP is one of the largest development organizations in Vietnam in the field of climate change response strategies. In line with our country program, we're focusing on eradicating poverty, working with the government on structural transformations, and trying to build resiliency. Like, for example, we got a range of climate change related projects under implementation at the moment. For example, we are focusing on the coastal zones where we are reaching out to 30 million beneficiaries and enhancing their resiliency against storm surges, increasing salinization processes of the coastal soil and water areas. And also recently built up to 4,000 houses, which are flood resilient and storm resilient. And can you understand me well, Mark?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I mean, to what extent are projects like this replicated across the region with an eye on combining projects that focus on climate insecurity to those that reduce economic inequality as well?
I think, as Grazia already mentioned, I mean, like, it's a structural problem or structural, structural phenomena when, like, in poverty levels increase, and because of increasing climate change impact.
Mm-hmm. I think we briefly lost your video. Yanto Hess, we'll come back to you in a moment. I'd like to move to Wen Gok Hui of Oxfam. Oxfam, together with the Mekong Development Research Institute, has recently published a very comprehensive report on the status of inequality in Vietnam. Can you tell us a bit more about the results of this analysis and what Oxfam is doing to address these complexities? Also, can you help us understand how has urban poverty, social exclusion, and inequality grown across the years? And what is the implication of these on a sustainable, peaceful, and more broadly based socioeconomic growth in the country?
Hello, everyone. So in Vietnam, we had just completed and published one report. I would like to provide some of the key findings of this report. It's in 4 points. The first one is that Vietnam had successful in reducing poverty, but the inequality is increased. And the second one is, the inequalities in Vietnam is the dimensional inequality. It's not a single and simple one. For example, inequality is not only in the gap of the income among a group of people, but also the gap of the access on the gap on of the access to the public services, and also the gap among of the difference in generational. So another findings of the research is that the interlinked issues of the inequality. For example, one person who are vulnerable and unequal, so they lack of they are poor, for example. So the poor will be lack of the opportunity to access to the public services. They may have a low voice to participate in the public spaces, and so they are more and more vulnerable to the impact of the climate change and hazards. So we call this kind of a cycle of the problem. So one people who think they are poor, or they are in a minority groups, migration groups, so they will face with the more vulnerable issue or things, and easiest impacted by climate change and hazards. The first findings of the report is like the current model of the economic development in Vietnam is not appropriate with the context into the context of the climate change, and especially the COVID situation. So under the impact of the climate change and the COVID, so the inequality is more visible among the different groups, and the gap, a little bit more and larger. So that is some of the key findings of the report of study, and how we address it. We do many things of analysis and to provide our suggestion to the government during by the campaign. But I can provide here the one of shortly in an example. For example, the tax policy. The government had a plan for increasing the value-added income tax to everyone. It means include the poor, and it's a bit more than 10% add into the VAT. So the most number of the people who are the poor will be vulnerable, will be impacted. And we're using of the economic model to analyze and to suggest to the government that you should not do that. And then the government accepted. And, by that way, most of the vulnerable people, the poor, is not to pay more taxes.
Thank you. Thank you. And I actually want to stay on this topic of inequality and turn to Hai An Deng of the World Bank. The Oxfam report shows, there are hazards associated with rising inequality. And I believe Grazia referenced this statistic earlier that was demonstrated in the Oxfam report, which is that Vietnam's 210 super rich earn more than enough in 1 year to lift 3.2 million people out of poverty and end extreme poverty in Vietnam. And I would be curious to learn your take on how the current trends of increasing inequality in Vietnam could hinder Vietnam's continued and peaceful socioeconomic development.
Yes. Good morning, everyone from Washington, D.C. Yes, and thank you, Mark, for the questions. So in fact, I completely agree, with my colleague Sao Huy Nguyen when he mentioned that the government of Vietnam, has been doing a very good job with reducing poverty, right, over the past, decades. But then at the same time, recently we see rising inequality, and in particular, rising inequality in terms of inequality of opportunities. Say, for example, like the poor households may not have equal, access to all the necessary services, schools, same quality of medical care, as a rich households in Vietnam. So that can be a cause for concern. And I think that, let me also take another example. For example, like bigger firms, especially, public, state, companies in Vietnam, they may have, better access, to capital, and they can influence, they can have even, a better treatment in terms of, regulation, right? So that can create, an unequal, playing field with smaller firms, informal firms in Vietnam. And in fact, there has been studies, showing that informal firms in Vietnam, can provide the engines of growth, and they can provide, most of, employment opportunities for the labor force in Vietnam. So indeed, I agree. We need to try to create, a better and more equal opportunities, so that all the different sectors in the economy can contribute equally and fruitfully to economic growth. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to turn back to Cécile Leroy. One of the conclusions of the report upon which we are basing our conversation today is that despite the tremendous economic growth in Vietnam over the last several decades, it's already been discussed at length, there still exists low capacity to provide timely support to the most vulnerable groups to climate hazards. In your experience, what are the main challenges of ensuring equal opportunities in the context of our current climate crisis? And how can the quality of the local governance impact on the effectiveness of these measures?
Okay, thank you, Mark. On this, yes, I mean, the two colleagues said previously, Vietnam has done an amazing job for the last 30 years. If you just look at the access to energy, it was 10% of the population accessing to energy in 86 and now 98%. Why do I say that? Because how you can reach the last 2% is actually a tremendous challenge, because they are very remote, so it's extremely expensive. So when you have a limited public budget, what kind of choice you have to make in reaching out this very last, but at a very expensive price? Or do you spend your budget to a wider part of the population? So this is the kind of challenge the government certainly is facing. How to deal with the natural resource and access of this natural resource when you are facing more and more degradation. I mean, this is already challenging to ensure equality of the people in regards to the variety of the situation here in Vietnam. I think working on the governance and the local governance is a key aspect because it will allow participatory planning. But it might be challenging, indeed, to have the voice of the more vulnerable really being heard by the local government. And I think here there are key players, which are the civil society organization, that can actually do a lot to link between the local authority and the vulnerable local minorities or more vulnerable part of the population. Civil society can train the public services, can train the community, can link, can provide access, and again, to promote the inclusiveness. And I think inclusion is a key word.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll turn back to Phuong Vu. As we mentioned earlier, agriculture is still the most vulnerable sector to climate change in the country. Often rural communities in particular are left behind in their ability to access information on climate events and strategies to increase their resilience to climate variability. In your view, how can research institutes help your ministry maintain its commitment to a more equitable and resilient agriculture sector?
Thank you, Mark. I think your question is very interesting because for March, we still continue to ensure the rural vulnerable groups by many ways and solutions. We continue with the agricultural restructuring so that it can be adaptive to the climate change, and we'll still revise and update the support policies and regulating on the agriculture supporting for the vulnerable groups, and we continue the formulations and implementation of the strategy planning and plan for the agricultural development. And it is very important that we should continue with the community awareness raising on the climate impacts. Should continue with the capacity building from the central to the local level on the gender equality related to the agriculture and climate impact. We should also we have the capacity building and clearly assign tasks and powers between the central government and the local government. We should strengthen the science and technologies application into the agriculture. For your question, how can the research institute can have much commitment to a more equitable, resilient agriculture? We really need the institution to have to transfer the advanced science and technology in the context of the climate change, and we need them to do the research to review the resilient models for Vietnam agriculture. Also, this institute can create the platform so that we can share the information and experience in terms of the climate change and other related issues. And very important thing is that we should implement the climate resilient programs under the regional context and also the global context, putting it into the Vietnam model. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will turn to Yanto Hess now. One of the findings of the study we're discussing today is that certain households, especially rural and ethnic minorities, use transfers and remittances as insurance against extreme climate events. And we know from studies that the use of remittances as an insurance against climate hazards is known to be a feasible coping strategy for the most vulnerable households. The coping capacity of these households, however, seems to mostly focus on the short term. From your experience, how can this strategy become a long-term sustainable solution for Vietnamese households? And what are the common issues and bottlenecks that policymakers should address to ensure equal opportunities for socioeconomic development?
Yes, thank you, Mark. I hope this time the video and the sound won't cut off.
You sound great.
Like to respond to your previous question again, like on the work UNDP is doing in support of different ministries here to respond to climate change. I mean, like the main thing is, besides the implementation phase, is also that we support different ministries in the planning exercises and budgeting exercises towards ensuring that any kind of government interventions over the next 5 to 10 years will consider climate change impacts, and those also trickle-down effects will benefit the most vulnerable communities. In a way, for example, we work together with MART to develop their sectoral adaptation plan for the agriculture sector, where we also undertook a range of national level risk assessments for flood risk, landslide risk, and a range of other risk factors, and then screened which kind of areas, which kind of provinces, which kind of communities are the most vulnerable. So MART could plan ahead of what kind of interventions they are rolling out in the countries to reach those who are most in need and most exposed to these kind of climate change impacts. Okay, that's just one quick wrap up to the other question. Now towards the remittances. From the initial findings, I saw that the benefits from the remittances after an emergency struck in the research from Grazia and her colleagues showed that the positive impact of the remittances were quite short-lived, which potentially relates to the situation that one household member goes into the city, gets a second job, sends money back home, but after one season, then returns back to the village. And that can portray a picture where you could understand or take it that remittances are not a long-term solution. And I would argue against it. Like if you look at some international studies, for example, IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, undertook a study in 2018 where they found that over 200 million migrant workers sent a total of 529 billion remittances to their families in developing countries in 2018. 529 billion that year was triple the amount of the overall annual overseas development, which was sent from developed countries to developing countries. So you can see what kind of finance we are talking about. In the same year, it was also exceeding the foreign direct investment, FDI, in most developing countries. So there's a huge potential for remittances, but it's a structural problem that on the one side is not perceived as being an eligible climate change adaptation option, because it's more or less happening behind the scenes. I mean, it's very difficult to track the finance, which is sent through different channels back into the developing countries. And it's also difficult to then influence how the money is used or can be used in order to increase the resiliency of the most poor against any kind of climate change related impacts. The other thing which I would like to highlight here, which I saw in my work experience in the last couple of years, particularly in the field of project development, is that many organizations as well as ministries work in silos and think in silos. For example, if there's somebody from a Ministry of Agriculture, they're mainly concerned about interventions which relate to their level of expertise. But I think especially with climate change, it's important to understand that climate change and climate change impacts will affect us on several levels and also at different sectors at the same time and simultaneously.
Thank you.
I think
Thank you. Well, the point of all these conversations is try to break down those silos and have conversations across disciplines, across sectors, in order to get at a solution to some of the common challenges that we're all facing. Thank you very much. And I'll come back to you, Yanto, for a final question to offer and elaborate on some of those solutions-based interventions that you might suggest. For now, though, I'd like to turn to Wengok Hui. We've been focusing a lot of our conversation on agriculture today, but it is not the only vulnerable sector to climate variability. More and more poor and marginalized people in Vietnam are being employed in construction activities, which are as exposed to climatic conditions as farming activities. What are, in your mind, the best social protection options to provide support to and formalizing employment status of least skilled workers, the poorest and also the most marginalized groups engaged in non-farm sector, especially in urban areas?
Thank you very much for the question. But actually, with the development of the economic in Vietnam, with the urbanization, with a lot of the people who leave their farm in the rural area and then they come to the city for the hunting job in the urban area. And that there are lack of the access to the public services and the lack of the opportunity to access to the public services. For example, the health care system, the insurance, and the education for their next generation also. Because when they come to the city, they do not only themselves, but also sometimes they can carry with their children. And lacking of the access to the public service is one of the most important the issues important issue is now in Vietnam. And that it come in my mind is that we need to open space for the uncared worker, for the informal workers who can access to the public services. Another thing is that to increase their opportunity to join formally to the decision-making process at a local level and to raise their voice. That I think when they can accept and have the opportunity to join with their public spaces, so they can build up their knowledge, aware about the policy of the government, and by that way, they would not be left behind by any of the policy of from the government. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'd like to turn to Hai-An Dang from the World Bank. Providing voice and opportunities to ethnic minorities, women, and poor households could contribute to poverty, to enhancing poverty mobility and ensure a more equitable socioeconomic development. So in your view, what more can be done to help these groups move out of poverty traps amid a climate crisis?
Yes. Thank you, Mark. So in the joint study, right, that we did with Grazia and other college, we define that, disadvantaged groups such as ethnic minorities, women, poor households, they basically, they are poorer and they are at a more disadvantageous, positions than other groups. So what to do to help them? Indeed, that's a big question, and I think that different organization, different agency, right? Like Oxfam, like the EU delegation, of course, and we all have our different. Maybe of course we have some common approach, but we also have our different approach. To helping the groups. Also, as a World Bank, we also have many different programs, for helping the groups. Ranging from, education, to infrastructure, right, to sustainable development, and so on. Yes. But then, in my personal opinion, as a researcher, yes. I could believe that ethnic minority groups, they may have their own, different culture, right, from the ethnic majority groups. For example, let me take an example. For most of the rural population in Vietnam, most of the rural ethnic majority population in Vietnam. For now, the dominant work sector is still agriculture, where basically we people, working on the farm, right? Similarly, for ethnic minority, they also work on the farms. But the farming practices for ethnic majority households in Vietnam, consists of, rice farming. But for ethnic minorities, it can be different. They can, grow tea, for example, right? Or they can have, different, forest products. So for that reason, I think that, the best policy, should be tailor-made to ethnic minorities, culture and their cultural, practices, so that, we can make the best use, of the different, cultural practices and also, the climate, conditions. And I also personally, know of some very successful, trading company, that can, basically export on the organic forest products made by ethnic minority groups to the EU. So I think that's a good way. That's a good example.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this conversation has made clear that climate variability takes a heavier toll on the most vulnerable populations in Vietnam, and that the economic and social disruptions caused by climate variability can have a potentially destabilizing effect. So I'm going to ask each of you the same question, and we only have about 5 minutes left, and there are 5 of you. So please keep your answers very brief. So here's the question. Cognizant of the increasing climate challenges, what would be 2 things that you would prioritize to mitigate the impact of climate on the most vulnerable and put a halt to the increasing divide between the richest and the poorest in Vietnam? So 2 brief ideas. Cécile Leroy, I will turn to you first.
Thank you. This is very challenging to only quote 2 elements, but for me then the first one would be invest in adaptation, resilience and preparedness. So equipped the people with information, with money, so with tools, with education, so they can adapt with the climate change pattern that are affecting the life. The second, maybe have a fiscal and social policy that is maybe more robust and that maybe asks the rich to contribute a little bit more and help the most vulnerable. That would be my 2 messages.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And hi, An Dang, over to you. 2 ideas to leave us with, please.
Yes,
very
thank
briefly.
You. Yes. So I would like to think that we should try to, adopt alternative, like methods or, practices. For example, organic farming or high precision, high value farming. I think that can be a good way to deal with, climate change. And the other idea is that I think that we should also diversify. For example, tourism, is also a good and growing sector in Vietnam. That can be another way to deal with climate change. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Phuong Vu, over to you for 2 ideas, 2 suggestions to leave us with.
Format, we think that we have 2 priorities. The first one is the community raising awareness. The second one is the investment in infrastructure, especially the shelter and the community house for the rural area that are most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Yanto Hess, to you for 2 ideas, 2 suggestions to leave us with today.
Yes, thank you very much. I would say the first thing for me would to focus on the youth, because younger generations will be the climate change leaders in the next couple of years to come. And I think providing educational opportunities for the youth, because they can also then take up alternative livelihoods used to do and send back remittances or be one of the incoming generators in the family. The second thing is that from my perspective, it's important to mainstream climate change risk in planning and budgeting processes. That means especially in a very rapidly developing country like Vietnam, it is important to already consider which kind of areas will be affected by climate change in the next 10 to 20 years. So you avoid placing new infrastructure projects in places which will be highly exposed to storm surges, to landslides, to other risk factors. So I think when you early on consider climate change impacts, you can avoid a lot of additional damage caused down the line.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And finally, to you, Nguyen Ngoc Huy, 2 ideas, 2 suggestions to leave us with.
My first idea is that related to the carbon inequality report that Oxfam had just published recently. We recommend that the rich who are, just only 10% of the population, but they're responsible for more than 50% of the carbon emission contribute to the global warming. So we act for the private sector companies and also business sector who need to invest in the climate resilience and to support for the poor people who are now most vulnerable to the climate change. And the second one is that we would like to recommend to the government to reform of the economic model, is that not rely on the nature assets resources, but it's more based on the humans and to protect the planet. And that is my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for your time today and for our conversation. That wraps it up. I'm going to turn the camera over to Grazia, who will offer some concluding remarks. Thank you to the panelists, and Grazia, over to you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to our speakers for this very insightful discussion indeed. This is the seventh debate regarding climate security, demonstrating the need for a continuous process of reflection around climate impacts, existing risks and threats, and social political security. However, this is the very first time in this series that we present and discuss hard evidence on how climate variability exacerbates existing threats such as structural inequality. I would like to underline three main points of reflections that I felt that they were important today. First is rising inequality of opportunities is a serious cause of concern in Vietnam. When studying the impact of climate hazards on inequality, only looking at economic inequality is not enough. Inequality is a multidimensional phenomenon, as it is the impact of climate on different groups in the population. The second is that strengthening local governance, opening for concerted and participatory planning, especially when it comes to natural resource management, can help mitigating the unequal climate impacts. And finally, building instead of suppressing the differences across cultures and practices between majority and minority ethnicities in Vietnam will be the key for a more equal, sustainable development. As many of you have pointed out, guaranteeing equal access to resource, voice, and participation of the most vulnerable group will be a fundamental contribution, but also an excellent challenge for the present and future of the government of Vietnam. Furthermore, it was clear today, as in previous debates, how vital the synergies between different actors are, from the national government and ministries and their knowledge of excellence of what happens in the field, to the extraordinary contribution of UN partners, World Bank, international organizations such as Oxfam, and research institutes. Creating opportunities for knowledge sharing and collaboration is vital and can help saving the life of many. And on this, the science and technologies developed by CGIAR and other research institutes can play a vital role. Like those of the previous debate, today's reflections must allow us to reflect and act correctly and concretely to seek tangible solutions and help millions throughout the country, in this case, Vietnam. We hope that our study and our analysis can contribute even a little to this ambition. Thanks again for tuning in, and see you next week for part 2 of Charting the Path to Peace, when we will be presenting and discussing the finding of our studying and analysis about the impact of climate variability on inequality in Vietnam. Thank you and goodbye.
All right, thank you all for listening. Thank you to Grazia. Thank you to CGIAR for another great conversation in this climate security series. To view other episodes in the series, again, please visit globaldispatchespodcast.com. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.